Thank you for being here and making your way here during lunch, which is fabulous. Today's theme is going to be, as it has been, how do we move to action? And what we hear from our work is a lot of times people hear about unconscious bias or they hear about inclusion and they're left with this question, what do I do? So this workshop was designed to answer that question. At our institute, what we do is we work to diagnose bias in organizations. Then we co-design solutions with managers. So we don't say, do this, we co-design what we're going to do, and we measure the efficacy of it. And all the while this is happening, we're observing. What are individual people doing in this organization? Not just what's the team doing. And this workshop is designed out of finding the best behaviors from well-intentioned managers who actually block bias in their organizations. So Stacy and I are going to co-facilitate this. We're calling it Design Lab because our aim is that you will leave here able to design conversations that block bias as they're happening. It would be great if we could prevent them, but they always pop up. What do you do in that moment to block them? So we're going to do an exercise. We're going to explain what the See Bias, Block Bias framework is. We're going to talk about barriers, because if you don't know how to see barriers, not understand barriers, but see barriers happening in your workplaces, you can't really block them. And then the toolkit, which we'll get to later, is for us to work through an exercise where you get to practice what that looks like. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Stacy Blakeyard.
So good afternoon. Great. And so I'm delighted to be here, and we just want to jump in. And so as Lori said, we want for you to think about how do you actually use this. And part of how we want to do that is just even warming you up, right? So I'd like for you to take a second and think about a situation or when you felt up. When did you feel that you were advantaged? And I'd like for you to think about a time or a situation where you felt like, what's going on here? Okay, so you felt disadvantaged. So just think of one of each, right? Where you felt advantaged, where you felt disadvantaged. You got it? Okay, so do me a favor, just talk to a neighbor next to you and share these, and then we'll come back. Okay, so just talk to a neighbor. Okay, so can you do me a favor? Let me just hear from a couple of you. How was that? And if you don't mind, just a little bit, if there was an example that really resonated, just if I could hear from you a little bit, right? Come to me, somebody. Right here.
For this band, years ago, I was in sales in New England, and I was the only female in the group, and I was the only minority in the group, and we had certain roles, and we were going to get hockey tickets.
Hockey tickets.
And also a fund for these golf outings.
Yeah.
I never got the hockey tickets.
Wow.
I never got invited, but the guys and their girlfriends and wives would get invited to the golf outing. So when I eventually quit, I laid it out on these are the reasons.
These are the reasons why I'm leaving.
This is why I'm leaving.
Wow.
And I had so much vacation and everything because I never took my vacation that I was able to leave within 2 days and still get paid for another couple.
Wow, okay. This is why I'm leaving. No hockey tickets, right? No, and that was the symbol, right? That was the thing. Number one person and still not getting these things, right? Because that's a good example. And, even though you're just talking a tiny bit, I can feel how painful that must have been.
Oh, it was a pleasure.
It's a pleasure to walk out. Great. Let me get another one, and maybe there might be one, with an advantage too.
Okay, I got two then.
Okay.
The separate of the disadvantage. I've worked in tech, as an infrastructure person for a long time. I worked in the UK, in England, for a long time, and in the 1988 to 1990, I worked in a job where, as a butch woman, I had to wear a skirt and hose, and I was crawling under people's desks, plugging in their computers.
Wow.
That's a disadvantage.
Wow. So wait a minute. As a butch woman wearing a skirt and hose while having to crawl into people's desks in a skirt. Okay. Yep.
I'm not very comfortable with the skirt at the best of times.
Okay.
And that is not the time to be in a skirt anyway. I think
Right.
everybody would agree.
Right.
The advantage. I'm also, as well as all these other things, I'm white. And even the fact that somebody's back with me doesn't care. And I was recently pulled over for speeding. And I had no fear.
No
I had
fear.
No fear.
Isn't that something? We can hear all of the conversation around doing X while black or doing X while a person of color and speeding, right?
Yeah, no
Sleeping, all these different things. No fear, right? Okay, this is great with these examples. Can I get one more? Yeah.
Yeah, so advantage my parents paid for my college tuition, so I never had to worry about student loans.
So never having to worry about college tuition because your parents paid for it. And there was the expectation that they were going to pay, right? So not stressful at all. And another thing, it could be quite stressful for people, right?
And then the disadvantage is just having to leave a meeting to go pump to breastfeed my child.
So the breastfeed. And I saw when I came here that they had a mother's room, but you know how many places that's not the case, right? But the disadvantage of feeling like, wow, as the...
Being in physical pain and needing to walk out on a meeting
Yeah.
because it was time to pump.
Okay, so these are powerful examples. Can you do me a favor and just get your neighbor who you spoke with and say thank you? Okay, so partly what we're going to talk about here, and Lori mentioned it in the opening session, is this concept of meritocracy. And you can see here from the definition, it says an idea where all individuals and ideals are hired, recognized, rewarded, and promoted. But it's ideal, right? It's not the current state. It's not steady state. And so we are, we have this, we want to have this, and we think we have it, but we don't always. It's an ideal that we're working towards. It's a goal, right? And so there can be this paradox of meritocracy. And so it's interesting looking at the research on this and the fact that actually with some organizations that say that they're meritocratic, that those will be the ones where you might find a lot of bias because in fact they say, well, we're done, right? We've done it. We have reached this. We're at this state and we're done. And that in fact, then we can see that having that belief is actually a paradox because that's where actually bias creeps in. So it could be like we're opening a door to let bias in. So we're going to talk, like, how does it work? How do we see bias creeping in? And so how many of you have seen this? Raise your hands. Right? It's been around for quite a while. When Lori and I were talking about it, I was like, I've seen this. I saw this back in my intro psych sociology class, right? Because I'm an organizational psychologist, right? So we know how this works, right? What do we see happening here? What's going on here? Somebody help me. With A and B, with those two blocks. Yeah.
We think that A is a darker square than B.
Right.
The perception of the shadow.
Yes. So we think that A, you nailed it. Tell me your name. Elise nailed it. We think that A is, that B is darker than A, right? Because of the perception of a shadow. But, right, if we look at it, they're not actually. They are not actually, one is not darker than the other. When Lori and I were practicing for this, I said, I never see the difference. And I'm a psychologist and I've seen this for 20 years. And yet every time I look at it the first time, I still think there's a shadow, right? So we think that we're actually kind of pros at shadows, right? And that we can see this and our brain expects to see a shadow. And so we see a shadow, right? And so that's how our brain works. And that's how we can actually see bias creep in. Okay. Okay, so it's like this optical illusion, just like that was, that we can see bias affecting. And let's take it to an organizational context. Like that was cool. It's a psychological experiment. But let's think about how we actually see this happening in organizations, which we do, right? It can actually affect how we work in organizations.
So we call this initiative See Bias, Block Bias, because we have to move beyond understanding that it exists. We have to be able to see what's happening in organizations in order to block it. So our job here, Stacy and my job, is to make sure that we find ways that you can see it. Now, I want to take a minute to define the word bias. Is this a new word to anyone in this audience? But isn't it often used like, I'm biased against you or you're biased against him, like an active role? And how I want to define it here is this. Bias is an error in decision making. I asked you, or Stacy asked you, to define the colors of those squares, but something you thought you knew about shadowing prevented you from giving me the right answer. In a similar way, you're going to want to see people for what they truly bring to your organizations, but something you think you know about broad categories of people will color how you actually see them. We call this a no-blame definition. No blame because it is not men against women, or white people against black people. We all have the same cultural context, so no blame. But research shows if you stop there by just saying no blame, you actually make it worse. Because what did I just do? I've normalized it. I've just told you we all do it. There's nothing we can do about it. And just like the paradox of meritocracy, you stop trying to make it better. So we couple this with two things. You have to say that we as individuals have an accountability and responsibility from blocking bias from affecting the outcomes of all our employees. And second, you have to have something to do, because you can't remember that all the time. And that's what this workshop is designed to do, give you something to do. Now, how does it work? You're making all sorts of shortcuts all the time to sort information. And some of them are very explicit. Like in hiring, you might say, let's only hire someone with 3 years experience. Because I've got 1,000 resumes, I just need a cutoff. It doesn't mean that this person with 3 years experience is better than this person with 2 years. It doesn't mean it. But we make these shortcuts just so we can get through the information. That's a cognizant or a explicit shortcut, while stereotypes act as one of those shortcuts unbeknownst to us, putting people into the yes category and putting people into the no category. So stereotypes act as functions of cognitive shortcuts. So what you have to do is interrupt them from influencing your decision making. These resume studies are the best way to see it. How many of you have seen them? Same resume, different names. Okay, Stacy, this is from your department. Psychology. Which department studies cognitive biases?
Psychology.
So just meaning
But not me.
Oh, but not her.
Cognitive psychologist.
Yes.
Okay.
And so what they do is they took a successful woman's resume and they gave it, and just changing the name had dramatically different outcomes, right? They really liked the men's resume. But here's the thing. The woman got 4 times the doubt-raising statements about her resume. Now, if you've been in a hiring meeting, you've heard it. Did she really get those grants and publications on her own? So that extra scrutiny, the extra bar that she has to pass, this is how bias plays out in your workplace. So when you hear a lot of scrutiny against perfectly qualified candidates, that's when you need to intervene. Did she really get it on her own? The second question is, it would be impossible to make such a judgment without teaching evaluations. That's probably the right question. But notice we're only asking good questions for the candidate we think doesn't fit in. So sometimes you'll hear a good question only asked to one candidate, and you can say, let's ask that for everyone, or not count it at all. So the first thing, okay, so Stacy's much better at me. We divided this up, and I left my division, so I'm looking at her. Did you see my face?
No, I just have my notes right here.
So you're going to kick it. You're going to take it back. Okay, good. So the higher bar we just heard, or extra scrutiny, is your clue that bias is probably at play. Okay?
Okay, so one of the other ways that we can see bias play out is in terms of language. And so kind of the most common way that we transmit and maintain culture is through language. Isn't that something? Right? And we can see that the words that we use are important. Would you agree? They transmit what's valued, what we really care about, right? So sometimes the words are really carefully considered, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes people just say things without realizing that in terms of what you're saying, you're actually transmitting what's important. Right? And so there's a whole language of leadership that we want to pay attention to. So we're going to do a thought experiment here. Okay, so the thing that I want for you to do is get in your head who is the top performer, a top performer that you know of. The person maybe at your job right now who you would say is the top performer. And I don't want for you to get a category. I want for you to get an actual person in your head, okay? So can you do that? Okay, so now what I want for you to do is to use words to describe this person, to describe the behaviors that you see this person do. And actually either write it down or put it on your, I'm learning here, use your electronic thing, whatever it is, your electronic thingy, and write it down there. So a couple of seconds, just a minute or so, please write down either on paper or on your electronic gadget, you know, what the behaviors are, what you see this person doing, okay? Just take a minute. Your top performer, the top performer in your organization. Again, think of a person, not a category. Okay, so now, oops, I'm sorry. Let's imagine this. Imagine that this top performer is gone. They're taken away. And you have to figure out, you have to replace them. Okay, so you have to replace this person. Okay, who would you replace this person with? Description A or description B? So you have a person over here who is a team player, they're friendly, good relationship manager, committed. And then on the other side, you have big thinker, influences others, take risk, independent. So how many of you would replace this top performer with A, person A? Okay. How many of you would replace the top performer with person B? Okay, do me a favor, just look around. Look around. Okay, so isn't that interesting that most of you in this room, 3/4 of you who raised your hand, would pick description B. Description B is the top performer. Because this is interesting, right? So the person B, we would describe as agentic, and that's the leadership style. And person A, we would describe as communal. So these in the leadership literature, these are the way that these two folks are described. And in our culture, we tend to lean towards description B. And this, in our little thought experiment that we did here, you all did that too, right? Because we have a view of who a leader is. And in this world, and actually when I teach in India, when I taught there, and also when I've gone to Santiago, Chile, when I've taught there, when I've gone to the UK, when I've gone to Uganda, actually every place I've gone, I can see some of this, right? So it's not even just here that we pick B and that we see that as the way that we would have leaders. The challenge is actually that you need both. Would you agree? And some of your descriptors, before I put this up, before you raised your hand, before I made you pick, showed that I was really impressed to hear you say, you said these communal categories, these communal activities. You all did that. But when we're forced to pick, you picked B, right? Now let's add another layer. Let's say that you add gender on this. Where do you think you expect to see men? B, right? B. Where do you expect to see women? A. So if we add not just that there's this way that we can see leadership and that we see it as more agentic than we do communal, it's that we then see men as being more agentic and women as being more communal. And if there's a mix up in that, there's some implications, okay? So there can be these narrow definitions of leadership that can exclude some people from being seen as leaders, right? It can just narrow it down so much that you exclude some people because they don't fit that agentic mode. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Whale Rider. Has anybody seen that movie? So good, right? So Pi, the young lady in the movie, wants to be the chief of her tribe. And her grandfather says, much like Layla Ali's father said, you can't do that. Girls just can't do that. You have to watch the whole movie. Is it worth watching? Oh, yes. It's really worth watching because it makes this point about the narrow definitions of leadership. It's exquisite. So Whale Rider, if you haven't seen it, good Saturday afternoon movie. Okay, so here's the thing, right? Let's say that we want to see who's a male leader, and Lori did this. She Googled CEO. And this is what she got. She Googled CEO, and this is what she got, right? And so let me tell you this. Sometimes when I'm teaching this very same thing, I will ask people to close their eyes and imagine a CEO, typical CEO in this culture, and to describe this person. And you know what my people describe? This. They describe this picture. So they say he's tall, he's white, he's a man, he's wearing a suit, he's trim, he doesn't have facial hair, he's got a blue or red tie, he wears wingtip shoes, he's married, he has 2.5 kids, he vacations certain places, he has kids, and they describe this person right here. When Lori showed me this, I just cracked up. This is who my people describe, right? And so then we wanted to figure out, well, geez, how far do you have to get to a female CEO? And this is what Lori found. That. Yes, that's it. That's what it is. And Barbie CEO is still there. Okay, so this is what we can see. The Google search for a CEO, and where do you have to go to get to women? And that's it. Okay. So here's the thing. Lori talked about we have this barrier of kind of extra scrutiny or higher bar, but there are other barriers. So one is that we can undervalue communal skills, that communal leadership, we can undervalue that and not see it as leadership. It's just you being nice. It's not leadership. And we can sometimes overvalue agentic skills such as driving, command and control. We can overvalue those. Not that they're not important, but you actually need both in order to be a strong leader. Does it make sense? Okay, we're going to take you to the next level.
Now, sometimes when people see this, they say, if we really need to match that picture, let's all behave as much like that as we can. Let's dress like that, let's act like it, let's talk like it. But have you ever seen it backfire? Yes, it did. And have you experienced actually getting a penalty from trying to enact the behaviors you were told to enact as a leader? And one of the questions people often ask is, how many people have ever been called too assertive by anyone in their organization? And yet, if you saw on that positive side, assertiveness was how we associate with leadership. So what's going on with that? Well, this next study kind of talks about it. What they did in this study was they filmed actors reading a script. Now, two of the actors they told to be very modest, one man and one woman, and self-deprecating. And two, they told to toot their own horns. Now, this is a US-based study. We're a very self-promoting culture. We're told here the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Turns out in Asia, they say the last duck gets shot. I've heard in EMEA, they say the tallest poppy gets cut, right? So this study works well in America. It does not work well. So imagine you're interviewing people from other parts of the world. However, in the US, if you toot your own horn, it does make you look more competent. Good, you're competent. Does this get the woman the job? No, because no one likes her. And because no one likes her, the only actor, remember they're reading the exact same script, the only actor offered more opportunities is the self-promoting man. Okay? Now this is called the likability competence trade-off, meaning for women, likability and competence are negatively correlated. So when we're young and eager and can't wait to please our boss, they say, oh, she's not super smart and competent, is she? So then we learn to toughen up, we drive, we direct meetings, and then they say, oh, she's so aggressive, and we don't get the promotion. Now for men, likability and competence are positively correlated. The more assertive and powerful they are, the more we like them as well. Now this is even more complicated for women of color. So in my experience, being an Asian American, my friend calls it the triple bind, being even more agreeable because of the model minority stereotype. I have to be even more agreeable than my white counterparts. I don't know if you have any comments about Black women.
So I also have a triple threat, and this is, I can be seen as the aggressive Black woman, and so the angry Black woman. And so I have to watch that on top of being a woman, being African American. I've got to watch that combination there of them being seen as possibly aggressive or mean or hostile. All of those things. And so this gets to some of the work that Melissa's going to talk about with intersectionality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And my sister-in-law is a Latina. She's from Mexico. She's an accountant. And people are always telling her, you're so passionate. She's closing the books on time. I would be passionate about that too. So all of us, men of color as well, Asian men are often seen as too soft, Black men as too assertive, Latinos always not as focused or not focused enough on business. So we all have these kinds of trade-offs, tall people versus short people, introverted versus not. It's just good to think about when we get criticized for our communication style, which is how this often comes out, it's rarely about the results we're producing, but that we rubbed somebody the wrong way. So when you think about penalties, if you hear someone being called too aggressive, pause. That could be some bias for you to block. If you hear someone being called too soft, again, pause. That could also be some bias for you to block, all right? Did they produce the result? No, that's not being discussed. They're too aggressive, they're too soft. Okay. Now, do you see that nod? She's managing me now very effectively.
So now we want to talk about, so how do you do this work? And I was fascinated by this, how do you see it coming? So, the ways that we just talked about can be a signal to you, like, oh, I got to pay attention. So then what do? And so there are these kind of monitor methodologies, criteria monitors, ways that we can think about it, frameworks to help you to position yourself to do this. Right, so the first one is consistency. And Layla talked about that actually this morning, right? So how is it that we think about using the same criteria fairly and universally for all people being discussed, right? If you're looking at somebody who's going to go into boxing, do they tell guys you're too pretty? Do they? I mean, Muhammad Ali, they did. He just said I was pretty, right? But for the most part, that's not the criteria by which they're being assessed, right? And so there's differential ways that we can use some criteria for some folks and not totally ignore them for other people, right? So that's one thing is, are we consistent in terms of how we are evaluating people? The second one is clarity. So it's not only important to be consistent, but how is it that we're clear? How is it that we know what it is that we're looking for and that we can actually look at as this is a lot of it, so a great deal, a medium amount, or a small amount, so that there's a top, middle, and bottom. So one of the things that we'll oftentimes hear is, they have great executive presence. What is that? What is executive? How do you know if you have a ton of it? How do you know if it's a little? Is this what you need to get the job done? Right? What is that exactly? Okay, and so it's how do you make sure that this is something that you can evaluate levels of performance, right? And that oftentimes, again, that will signal a place where bias might be creeping in if you can't do that. The third one is trust. So we're not going to be able to get any of this work done if there's not the assumption of that we are doing this for a purpose that benefits the individual and that's also going to benefit the organization, right? There just has to be, and meriting, there has to be an assumption of trust that you're doing this for purposes that's going to benefit, right? And if that's not there, you're not going to do this work because it does make you a bit vulnerable to ask these questions, to do this work. So the trust needs to be there. If that's not there, then you're not going to be able to do the work. Does that make sense? Okay, so this consistency, the clarity, and the trust are some of the conditions that we need in order to be able to do this work of blocking bias.
I think you figured out by now that criteria is your friend. If you suspect, remember you hear a higher bar, you hear criticism of being too aggressive, and you want to intervene, saying, I don't think she's so aggressive. Again, you're not being clear what the criteria of performance is either. But if you go back to criteria and you clarify it, as Stacy said, and you're consistent with it, you'll be able to turn these bias conversations back to some sort of logical way we're going to evaluate. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to block bias in conversations. We're going to practice what happens when you hear the higher bar. What would you say? So in your handout is a case study. It's a one-pager. This is an example dialogue that you're going to practice seeing and blocking bias around. This was taken from research. One of our graduate students sat through hundreds of interviews at a high-tech company, plus the roundups, so how people discuss the candidates afterwards. And these comments are taken from a compilation of those conversations. So I'm going to read the case study so you don't have to worry about reading it, but you can follow along. Imagine you're in a company that says diversity and inclusion is a priority, and we're going to start by hiring more women in. You're going to observe the roundup after an interview company. Every single candidate being interviewed has gone through 2 screens, one for fit and one for technical competence. So to even be in this one day of interview, they've gone through a screen. The design of the day are 5 whiteboarding sessions, of which a different manager supervises each one, and afterwards they give their feedback to the manager, the hiring manager. The 3 categories of criteria they're using are technical fit, cultural fit, and getting stuff done. Okay? The roles, we have 2 managers in this conversation. Goodwin Yang is a engineering manager who did the interview, but he's not the hiring manager. Sue Hammer also an engineer, is the hiring manager. Ella Duncan is the candidate they're discussing. Now, the question Goodwin put the candidates through was new. They've never used it before. It was somewhat ambiguous, and quite frankly, no one did very well with it. Here's the dialogue. Goodwin says of the candidate Ella, Ella was sweet. She seems like a good person, just not a fit here. Sue, the manager, says, okay, well, let's talk about her culture fit then. And Goodwin replies, well, she might fit in marketing, but not in R&D. Sue says, why not? Goodwin said, she asked so many questions during the problem. Seriously, I can't spend all day babysitting her. Sue, don't you think she asked those questions because the problem was ambiguous? Goodwin, yeah, but not all the candidates asked so many questions. I mean, others just gave it their best attempt. Sue, yes, but in the end, did she come to a good solution? Goodwin, yeah, she can code, but she was so nervous. She can't convince me of her decisions. I can't recommend moving forward with her. So that's what you would have read if it weren't cut off on the screen. Okay. So what you're going to do is there's these little cards inside your handout. There's a deck of both blue and red cards. The red cards are on top. There should be in a little envelope. So take all the red cards out, which are the top. And what we're going to do is see all the patterns of bias that you might see in this dialogue. And my friend Stacy is going to start with an example of how that might work.
So the one that I'm going to do is undervaluing communal skills. So undervaluing communal skills. We talked about that one, right? So I could say, wow, I just see that you're talking about her asking questions. And actually, I think asking questions is, kind of important. And I noticed also that we're saying that she's really sweet and, she seems like she's a good person. And are we kind of not paying attention to the benefit of that? Like that could actually be helpful? But maybe this asking questions, wasn't it an ambiguous question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I might take the higher bar. You said she can code. Wasn't that what we asked for? But now that's not good enough. So I think you held her to a higher bar. Okay. So with a partner, what we want you to do is go through all the red cards and pull out all of these patterns that you see in this dialogue. Okay. So use the barrier cards with the partner to see everything you can see. You can say, oh, this is why I see this. I don't see this one. So there's kind of a pile you see and pile you don't. Identify all the ones that you see. And after you're done with your partner, pick one you want to work with, okay? So with your partner, use the red cards to see all the patterns of bias, like Stacy and I saw, and then pick one that you want to talk about in the end. Any questions? Okay. Who'd like to just share what you're seeing? Who can share with us what you're seeing? Yes, please. Most of them are in there. So not just one pattern of bias in one conversation. Yes, what would you like to share?
For me, I found mainframe and criticism of communication style both in one. When he said, yeah, she can code, but she was also nervous. So not necessarily too soft, but just, challenge first, stop communication first. And it would have been probably more.
Exactly. It had nothing to do with her performance, right? One more comment? Yes, please. Unwritten rules. What was the unwritten rule?
Oftentimes, everybody has unwritten rules, just like you said, really sweet, good person, but not a fit. Where is that rule written? Somebody will not be a fit. And also, code was a real criteria, but there's unwritten rules that somebody has to be able to convince for the decision. That wasn't the criteria to begin with. If it was, it should be part of the criteria. Everybody should code and be able to explain.
Right. And we often say, too, is the coding the part that we can't teach or the convincing the part that we can teach? Some of these deal breakers are things that our on-the-job training will actually solve for, but a great coder is not something that our on-the-job training is going to solve
And
for.
also, if you find the right coder, is that more important for you, or you want somebody to go and convince people? What are you looking for?
Exactly. So lots of confusion and ambiguity. Ambiguity is a condition where bias is very likely to creep in. So now we're going to say, does everyone have their one that they're going to work on? I know there's a lot. If you don't, while we're talking, you can pick one. Okay, so the blue cards we're calling criteria to monitor cards. So you don't have to say exactly what's on them. But what they're designed to do is to have you start to design conversations when you hear them saying things like, she can't convince me, right? Or vaguely, she's not a good fit. When you hear that, what are some things you can start to say to return to a conversation about the right criteria? So the blue cards are designed just to help you figure out how do you intervene in these conversations. So Stacy and I are going to role play again what that might look like.
Sure. So the blue card that I picked, the tactic that I want to use is referencing original criteria. So say that we're talking and I say, hey, wait a minute. Aren't we adding in these other things? Isn't our primary criteria, can she code? Right? Can she code? And so let's go back to that. Let's assess that. That's what we said we were going to do. Okay?
Absolutely. So I was going to pick agree to the importance of criteria. Because to your point, it sounds like Goodwin's making up all sorts of criteria with no ranked order. And I think if I were talking to him, I might say, let's agree to the importance of criteria. We have on-the-job training. We're really looking for creativity of thought in all kinds of styles. I think I want to rank as the hiring manager, the most important criteria is, can she code, right? So I might use that as a way to bring back the conversation to where I want it to go. So with your partner, with the one that you've agreed on, you can each pick different blue cards. Try out what you might say to someone like Goodwin if that was happening in a conversation, using the blue card, not to necessarily repeat exactly, but just as a starting place to see if you could move the conversation more towards something where you can have a conversation that's consistent and fair, clear, and with the kind of trust that you want to build. So you have 3 minutes to do that. Now, with your partner, share one new action you want to take next week when you go back to work, okay? So with your partner, share out of this workshop, out of the whole day, one new action you're going to take when you go to work next week. Go. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So can we hear just a couple? What might be some of the actions that you might want to do? Let me hear just a couple. What's an action that you think you can take based on what you've gotten from the morning and from this session? I see a hand over here.
So the caller wants to interact with coworkers on our team. And so we see everyone's scorecards that come through, like round interviews. And so like creating templates for scorecards to get rid of bias.
Nice. So creating templates for scorecards to get rid of bias. Isn't it interesting how things can be built in? You've heard all of this, right? Lori said none of this is made up. All of this actually happened. All of this actually happened. That's great. Give me 2 more actions. Yeah.
I want to work with our recruiting team and do the same exercise.
Yes. Oh, that's good.
Take the cards with you.
Yes,
And there's some
take them with
extras.
you.
Take them with you.
So that's one of the reasons this was created, is like, how can you actually do something and use this? Like that, this is real. And I don't know about you, but I feel so much better if I feel equipped. If I have a tool or something that I can do, besides just sit there and say, this isn't fair, right? Can I get one more action? Yeah, right here. And then I'm going to finish with you. Okay.
I think the roundtable discussion's an interesting one on candidates, but I think one of the opportunities is at the beginning of that discussion, set the context, remind people of the criteria at the beginning,
Yes.
and then you can easily redirect them back to it.
Oh, Jennifer, I love it. Right. So it's like your process and how you run it, and up front setting that criteria, and then you can go back to it and say, hey, wait a minute, didn't we talk about this? Because you'd be surprised. Like, let's just get them in, and paying attention to task, but not process. Right. So how do you pay attention to your process so that you can go back to it when you get into these tricky spots where you see bias, right? Okay, that's great. And last one right here. And then we got one more?
I have one more thing to say. After
Okay. Yeah.
Where people will be interviewing and not be hiring managers and tweaking the position description
Yeah.
and turning that into actual criteria.
Nice.
This is
Helpful.
the time to really say yes or no, or I agree or disagree.
How timely it is, right? So she's on a committee that is a search group that they're actually right now figuring out the description, or they have it, but she wants to go back and tweak it.
Yes, Berkeley Lab, shameless plug.
Berkeley Labs.
Love that.
And if you want to remember some of the tips, also inside your envelope is this booklet that runs through some of the things we discussed today. So if we're going to share this with your colleagues, you can run through this booklet with them. Now, these packets were not easy to assemble. Can you imagine putting 100 of them together? So I want to thank my colleague Karen Howe, who is in the back. She is the mastermind who put them all together for us. Thank you, Karen. And Stacy's going to wrap up for us.
I just want to thank you all for coming to this session. That the title, that Lori's probably her background and how she's known helped to bring you here, because this is the deal. I love the examples given that you can actually use this. We did a workshop once where people came to this and we gave a tool, like this is a tool, and then we got feedback, and the feedback was like, oh yeah, this was cool and the speakers were interesting, but you know, this doesn't really have anything to do. And then they wrote back, this was the evaluation we took at the session. The next day they wrote back and they said, we have to apologize. We got back to our organization, we saw it happening, and we turned and we said bias right there. Right when we saw it happening, and then we had a tool that we could use, so we apologized for the 3.0 we gave you, right? And they didn't apologize, but this is the deal. How is it that we can give you something that you can use, and that you use it, then it spreads out to other parts of your organization, and that if we see bias, we can block bias. Thank you all so much. There was a hand back there. Did you want to get something in last?
I had a question.
Yeah.
So I have seen other side of criterion. Sometimes criterion define a very strict box.
Yes.
And how to avoid that, or how to, if you are in that box, like you were interviewing, or you see a box and people are expecting, maybe it's a male, maybe it's just a very strict personality before, and you're a little bit outside of it. Or you are interviewing somebody who's outside of it, how do you handle that?
It's a great question. So normally when we have a very narrow definition of success, like the CEO image search, you are only replicating the status quo. And if we're looking for innovation, we want to take a portfolio approach to hiring, not replication approach to hiring. So one of the conversations you can start to have is, what's the total portfolio of knowledges, skills, approaches, and heuristics that will drive innovation on this team? Who do we already have, and who do we need to complement it? So sometimes that will help you broaden the criteria. You can also go through a growth mindset approach, which is, we want to have people who will learn and grow in our organizations, not who have already proven something. Therefore, I'm interested in the journey they've taken, the hurdles they've hit and overcome, their creativity and resilience through problem solving. So you can either redefine the criteria by looking at a portfolio approach. You can broaden the criteria by saying not just exact qualifications, but journey, right? And then share ideas that you come up with one another. It's all learned behavior. We all learned how to interview that way from someone else, learn from each other, create new pathways, and share them amongst each other.
Great question. Thank you so much.
Thanks.